When you hear the name Isaac Newton, what comes to mind? Probably this giant of science, right? The guy who figured out gravity, invented calculus, basically wrote the rule book for motion. He's this monumental figure, almost more of a myth than a man. But what if I told you that the so-called father of the age of reason spent way more of his time on alchemy and, well, heresy than he ever did on physics? Yeah. So let's peel back the layers of that legend and find the real person underneath.
I mean, just listen to this. This is how his friend, the astronomer Edmund Halley, described him. Even while he was still alive, people saw Newton as something else, something beyond human, a mind that had somehow touched the divine. He achieved this legendary status that, honestly, very few people in history ever have. And that really is the question, isn't it? Because behind that towering intellect, behind the scientific revolution he kicked off, there was this incredibly complex, secretive, and frankly often tormented person. So to really get his genius, you first have to understand the man himself.
And that whole story, well, it starts in this lonely stone farmhouse in the English countryside. It begins with a childhood that was so marked by loss and isolation, it would go on to shape his entire life.
He was born so tiny his own mother said he could have fit inside a quart pot. He never even met his father, who died before he was born, and then, at just 3 years old, his mom remarried and moved away, leaving him with his grandparents. Just imagine that feeling of abandonment. It became the defining wound of his entire life.
So, while all the other kids were out playing games, Newton, he played, as a friend later put it, philosophically. He funneled all that loneliness into this incredible hands-on creativity. He wasn't just messing around, he was reverse engineering the world. He built a tiny working windmill powered by a live mouse, a water clock that actually kept time, and he'd even scare the locals by tying lanterns to kites at night.
But underneath all that quiet inventing, a serious anger was building up. As a teenager, he kept this list of all his sins, and this entry is just chilling. It shows this intense resentment he had for his mother and his stepfather for leaving him. So this wasn't just some quiet, nerdy kid. This was a deeply wounded young man who held on to his grudges for a lifetime.
And it was this intense inner world, a world born from feeling completely alone, that would, crazily enough, become the very furnace for his world-changing discoveries.
So in 1665, the Great Plague hits. Cambridge University shuts down, and Newton is forced to go back to that same lonely childhood home. But here's the twist. Instead of being a prison, that forced isolation became his sanctuary. For 2 solid years, with no one to bother him, his mind just exploded. Historians call it his annus mirabilis, his wondrous year.
See, the math they had back then was pretty static. It was great for shapes, but terrible for describing a world that was constantly moving and changing. So, what does Newton do? He just invents a whole new kind of math to do it. He called it fluxions. Today we call it calculus. It was this revolutionary tool for calculating everything from a falling object to a planet hurtling through space. And this leads to that next great leap. You've heard the story about the apple. The real genius wasn't just seeing it fall, it was asking the question, what if that force, gravity, doesn't just stop at the top of the tree? What if it keeps going, way, way out? Could it be the exact same force that's holding the moon in orbit around the Earth? That was the game-changing idea. A single, universal law for both the heavens and the Earth.
So, when the plague finally eased up and Newton went back out into the world, he brought these incredible discoveries with him. But sharing his work, especially his work on light, turned out to be a much more explosive and controversial debut than he ever could have imagined.
Okay, so for centuries, everybody, and I mean everybody, thought white light was pure and that prisms somehow stained it with color. Newton thought, let's test that. He set up what he called his experimentum crucius, the crucial experiment. Here's where his genius really shines. He used a second prism. After splitting light into a rainbow, he used another barrier to isolate just one color, say blue. And then he passed that blue light through a second prism. And what happened? It stayed blue. It didn't break down any further. The mind-blowing conclusion? White light isn't pure at all. It's a mashup with every color in the rainbow.
And he didn't just stop with the theory. He took this new understanding of light and solved a huge problem with telescopes at the time, this blurry rainbow halo effect that messed up the view. He designed and actually built, with his own hands, a brand new kind of telescope that used a mirror instead of a lens.
It produced these incredibly sharp images, and when he showed it to London's Royal Society, it caused an absolute sensation.
But all this success put him on a collision course with another giant of science, Robert Hooke. And these two guys, they were polar opposites. Hooke was a showman, loved the spotlight, and was quick to claim ideas as his own. Newton was intensely private and could not stand to be criticized. Hooke was convinced light was a wave, Newton was sure it was a particle. This clash of ideas and personalities ignited one of the bitterest rivalries in the history of science.
In fact, these fights with Hooke would drive Newton to retreat back into his shell for years. But it was during this quiet period that he dove headfirst into his true passion, a secret life that he believed was far, far more important than the science that was making him famous.
His poor assistant, who had to keep the furnaces burning in his private lab, had no real clue what Newton was up to. He just knew that his boss was driven by this relentless, almost superhuman obsession. He wrote that Newton was aiming for something beyond the reach of human art. He wasn't just doing science, he was chasing some ultimate secret he believed was just waiting to be found.
And here it is. This is the great secret. There were two Isaac Newtons. The public Newton was the brilliant professor, the president of the Royal Society, the father of modern physics. But the private Newton, the man behind the locked door, was an obsessive alchemist and a radical theologian who was convinced the church had corrupted the true word of God.
For 3 decades, he worked away in his lab. The fire was almost always burning, day and night. And he wasn't just dabbling in alchemy. No, this was a deep, systematic quest for the philosopher's stone. Not just to turn lead into gold, but because he believed alchemy held the key to understanding God's original act of creation, the very building blocks of matter itself.
The sheer scale of this secret obsession, it's just staggering. After he died, people went through his papers, and yeah, they found over 1 million words on physics and math, but they also found nearly 1.5 million words written on alchemy and theology. Think about that. This was not a hobby. This was his life's central mission.
You see, for Newton, science, alchemy, and religion were not separate things, not at all. They were all part of one single, unified quest to read the mind of God. He truly believed that the ultimate truths of the universe had been revealed to ancient prophets, but were now hidden in codes within the Bible and old alchemical texts. And he believed his life's work was to be the one to finally rediscover it all.
So we're left with this unbelievably complex person. He wasn't just a hero of science and reason. He was a mystic, a heretic, an alchemist, a man driven by childhood wounds and this all-consuming desire to decode every secret of the universe, both physical and divine. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If the simple story we're all told about Newton is only half the picture, what other legends are just waiting to be untangled?